Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. Picking up where we left off last time, continuing the early national period. The first diocese in the new United States was the Diocese of Baltimore, Maryland, created by Pope Pius VI on the 6th of November, 1789. By way of background reminders, when the subject of a Catholic bishop for the new country was first raised, the clergy opposed it for fear of incurring the ire of the Protestant establishment which controlled the government, as well as fear that a bishop would steal the property of the suppressed Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order. And recall, the survivors, the former Jesuits, had taken great pains to shelter that property in a civil corporation. They incorporated as the Society of the Reverend Gentlemen. This was the unanimous opinion expressed at a clergy meeting at White Marsh, Maryland, in October of 1784. They changed their minds owing to, first, problems which Apostolic Prefect John Carroll could not address with his limited faculties as Apostolic Prefect. Second, evidence of religious freedom in the new country, enduring, at least legally. Third, and the Episcopals' action in getting their own resident bishop in November of 1784 with no government reprisals. The Episcopals were those former Anglicans, Church of England, colonists who decided to remain in the new country. But they couldn't be Church of England because it was no longer part of England. So the Episcopals. Hence, it was at another meeting, clergy meeting, this time in March of 1788, that they agreed to a petition to Pope Pius VI requesting an ordinary resident bishop. The Holy See responded favorably and erected the first diocese in Baltimore with John Carroll as the founding bishop. During one of John Carroll's enduring accomplishments, both an accomplishment he considered enduring at the time and one which has in fact endured, is his support of Catholic education. Recall that during the colonial period, attendance at school was not mandatory, that no public schools the way that we currently understand them existed. And we'll cover how that happened. That happened as a result of some social and political movements beginning in the 1830s. And in terms of the law, the words education and school do not even appear in the Constitution. Yet schools were not illegal either. Nevertheless, the anti-popery laws in the colonial period did prohibit official Catholic schools from existing. The Bohemia Manor, as it was called in Maryland, which was attended by the Carrolls and some other children of Catholic families, was a private affair, and of course it was not publicly identified as a school to outsiders. But with religious liberty guaranteed in the Constitution, Catholic schools could exist. So John Carroll held a meeting of the priest on the 15th of May, 1789, at which it was agreed they would create a pamphlet explaining the need for a Catholic school and the scope of what exactly such a school would be. And this pamphlet would be used for both publicity awareness raising, as well as fundraising. In keeping with Carroll's accommodationist ecclesiology, it was to be ecumenical, open to members of all religions. In fact, the word Catholic did not appear in the advertisement for the nation's first Catholic school. Quote, agreeably to the liberal principles of our Constitution, the school will be open to all students of every religious profession. Further, the pamphlet read in part, quote, the object of the proposed institution is to unite the means of communicating science with an effectual provision for guarding and preserving the morals of youth. The benefit of this establishment should be as general as the attainment of its object is desirable. The first donor was Cousin Charles Carroll of Carrollton, yet fundraising did not go as hoped, so the proposed institution did not open until November of 1791 as Georgetown Academy on the Potomac River. The first student was William Gaston, whose professional life culminated as a justice on the State Supreme Court of North Carolina. From that beginning, Georgetown now is a full university. It offers degree programs in 48 disciplines. It has an endowment of $1.82 billion, has a faculty of 2,173, an enrollment of 17,849 from 135 countries, on a campus of 104 acres in Washington, D.C. Its alumni include 2 U.S. presidents, Lyndon Johnson and Bill Clinton. Bishop John Carroll and 4 Catholic laymen sent a special message to President George Washington in 1789. The document does not have a more specific date, just the year, 1789, which is unusual for Carroll and for Washington. The others were Cousin Charles, Brother Daniel, Thomas Fitzsimons, whom we've already met, and Dominic Lynch of New York. It read in part, quote, by example, as well as by vigilance, you extend the influence of laws on the manners of our fellow citizens. You encourage respect for religion and inculcate by words and actions that principle on which the welfare of nations so much depends, that a superintending providence governs events of the world and watches over the conduct of men. So this is a reference to Washington abolishing Guy Fawkes Day in the Army, which we talked about in a previous session. Skipping down. This prospect of national prosperity is peculiarly pleasing to us, meaning Catholics, on another account, because whilst our country preserves her freedom and independence, we shall have a well-founded title to claim from her justice equal rights of citizenship, as the price of our blood spilt under your eyes, and of our common exertions for her defense under your auspicious conduct, rights rendered more dear to us by the remembrance of former hardships. When we pray for the preservation of them, where they have been granted, and expect the full extension of them from the justice of those states which still restrict them. And note, Carroll did not use the word Catholic in this entire letter, so he's talking around it. Washington responded on the 12th of March, 1790, in part, quote, I feel that my conduct in war and in peace has met with more general approbation than could reasonably have been expected, and I find myself disposed to consider that fortunate circumstance in great degree, resulting from the able support and extraordinary candor of my fellow citizens of all denominations. I thank you, gentlemen, for your kind concern for me. While my life and my health shall continue, in whatever situation I shall be, it shall be my constant endeavor to justify the favorable sentiments you are pleased to express of my conduct. And may the members of your society, meaning Catholics in America, animated alone by the pure spirit of Christianity, and still conducting themselves as the faithful subjects of our free government, enjoy every temporal and spiritual felicity. Note, Washington also did not use the word Catholic, only Christianity. John Carroll received documents confirming what he had already been told informally, that he was to be the founding bishop of the proto-diocese of the country. This raised the question of where to be ordained, because only a bishop can ordain another bishop. And there were no bishops that existed in the United States to do so. For reasons of antipathy and mistrust already covered, Carroll did not even consider going to Rome to be ordained. Havana would have been one possibility, but at the moment, the Diocese of Havana was sede vacante. Quebec was another possibility, since Carroll had visited Canada already, but resentment was still fresh over the war. Remember, the American Revolution included an invasion of Canada by the American Revolutionary Army. So Carroll chose to visit the home of Anglo-Catholic friends, English Catholic friends, he made while studying at the English schools in Belgium. Thomas Weld, W-E-L-D, was owner of Lulworth Castle in Dorset, England. And he was, at that moment in 1789, the paterfamilias of an old Catholic family. Like the Calverts before him, he managed to ingratiate himself with the monarch, despite his Catholicism, by the expedient of lavish hospitality and generous financial gratuities to the monarch. When the anti-popery laws were relaxed in 1780, Weld asked George III if he could construct a church on his own property. King George hesitated, especially after the Gordon riots, commenting that if it did not look like a church, then no one would know it was a church. Weld took the hint. On Candlemas Day, 1786, the cornerstone was laid for a circular structure that would externally appear as a mausoleum, typical on wealthy estates. Privately, the Catholics, in the know, would call it St. Mary's Chapel. This was the first Catholic church, so to speak, constructed in England since the Protestant movement began. Carroll sailed from Baltimore, arriving in London on the 22nd of July, 1790. Next consideration was the officiating prelate. After the apostolic vicar Challoner died, whom we've already met, he was followed by James Talbot. James Talbot died in October of 1789. This left Charles Walmsley, that's W-A-L-M-S-L-E-Y, as apostolic vicar of the Western District of London to perform the ceremony. The ordination took place on Sunday, August 15th, 1790, in the newly constructed chapel, costumed as a mausoleum, on the Weld family estate. Before returning home, Carroll received messages from a Father Jacques-André Emery, E-M-E-R-Y, the Superior General of the Society of Saint-Sulpice, specialist in seminary formation. They were rendered unemployed by the French in France by the Revolution, and wondered if Carroll would be able to find them remunerative ecclesiastical work in his new diocese. This inquiry led to the establishment of the first seminary in the United States to be discussed in due course. Meanwhile, Bishop Carroll crossed the Atlantic again, arriving in Baltimore, delivering his first sermon as bishop on Sunday, December 12, 1790, in St. Peter's Church in Baltimore. Catholics and non-Catholics were invited. Carroll's thoughts at this transitional time in his life were confided to friends. In particular, his desire, quote, to wrest out of the hand of fanaticism the rod of oppression, which I am well persuaded are the only sentiments that can ever establish, by being generally adopted amongst Christians of every denomination. Religion, with its attendant virtues, would challenge our first belief, and the religion of our choice would necessarily be the Christian. In the same year, 1790, the first Supreme Court assembled in New York City, which was then functioning as the nation's capital. The first Chief Justice was John Jay, whom we've met as one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers. Here are the thoughts on the judiciary found in the Federalist Papers. This is an excerpt from Federalist number 78 on the Judiciary Department. This was published in McLean's, New York, again signed by as Publius. To the people of the state of New York, we proceed now to an examination of the Judiciary Department of the proposed government. In unfolding the defects of the existing Confederation, meaning the Articles of Confederation, the utility and necessity of a federal judicial structure has been clearly pointed out. Whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution, because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. The executive not only dispenses the honors, but holds the sword of the community. The legislature not only commands the purse, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of the society, and can take no action, no active resolution whatsoever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend on the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. This simple view of the matter suggests several important consequences. It proves incontestably that the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power, that it can never attack with success either of the other two, and that all possible care is requisite to enable it to defend itself against their attacks. It equally proves that though individual oppression may now and then proceed from the courts of justice, the general liberty of the people can never be endangered from that quarter. I mean, so long as the judiciary remains truly distinct from both the legislature and the executive. For I agree that there is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers. And it proves, in the last place, that as liberty can have nothing to fear from the judiciary alone, but would have everything to fear from its union with either of the other departments, that as all the effects of such a union must ensue from a dependence of the former on the latter, notwithstanding a nominal and apparent separation, that as, from the natural feebleness of the judiciary, it is in continual jeopardy of being overpowered, awed, or influenced by its coordinate branches, and that as nothing can contribute so much to its firmness and independence as permanency in office, this quality may therefore be justly regarded as an indispensable ingredient in its constitution, and in a great measure as the citadel of the public justice and the public security. The complete independence of the courts of justice is peculiarly essential in a limited constitution. By a limited constitution, I understand one which contains certain specified exceptions to the legislative authority, such, for instance, as that it shall pass no bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, and the like. Limitations of this kind can be preserved in practice no other way than through the medium of courts of justice, whose duty it must be to declare all acts contrary to the manifest tenor of the Constitution void. Without this, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. Some perplexity respecting the rights of the courts to pronounce legislative acts void, because contrary to the Constitution, has arisen from an imagination that the doctrine would imply a superiority of the judiciary to the legislative power. It is urged that the authority which can declare the acts of another void must necessarily be superior to the one whose acts may be declared void. As this doctrine is of great importance in all the American constitutions, a brief discussion of the ground on which it rests cannot be unacceptable. There is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of power may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. If it be said that the legislative body are themselves the constitutional judges of their own powers, and that the construction they put upon them is conclusive upon the other departments, it may be answered that this cannot be the natural presumption, where it is not to be collected from any particular provisions in the Constitution. It is not otherwise to be supposed that the Constitution could intend to enable the representatives of the people to substitute their will to that of their constituents. It is far more rational to suppose that the courts were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and the legislature, in order, among other things, to keep the latter within the limits assigned to their authority. The interpretation of the laws is the proper and peculiar province of the courts. A constitution is, in fact, and must be regarded by the judges as a fundamental law. It therefore belongs to them to ascertain its meaning, as well as the meaning of any particular act proceeding from the legislative body. If there should happen to be an irreconcilable variance between the two, that which has the superior obligation and validity ought, of course, to be preferred. Or, in other words, the Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute, the intention of the people to the intention of their agents. Nor does this conclusion by any means suppose a superiority of the judicial to the legislative power. It only supposes that the power of the people is superior to both, and that where the will of the legislature declared in its statutes stands in opposition to that of the people declared in the Constitution, the judges ought to be governed by the latter rather than the former. They ought to regulate their decisions by the fundamental laws rather than by those which are not fundamental. This independence of the judges is equally requisite to guard the Constitution and the rights of individuals from the effects of those ill humors which the arts of designing men, or the influence of particular conjunctures, sometimes disseminate among the people themselves, and which, though they speedily give place to better information and more deliberate reflection, have a tendency, in the meantime, to occasion dangerous innovations in the government and serious oppressions of the minor party in the community. Okay, it goes on and on, but you get the point. So he has a very so limited view of the judicial branch that it's almost unrecognizable from what it's become today. Here is, in part, what the Constitution actually ended up writing. This is Article 3, the judicial branch, Section 1. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may, from time to time, ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior, and shall, at stated times, receive for their services a compensation, which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. And then there's Section 2 and 3 that go through some more details, but initially, the Supreme Court was created. Well, I mean, the Constitution created the branch and stipulated there was to be a Supreme Court and inferior courts. So this was written into law by the Judiciary Act of 1789, September 24th, in the first session of the first Congress. It enacted the Supreme Court to consist of a Chief Justice plus 5 Associate Justices, and stipulated that at least 4 must be present for there to be a quorum, and that they should hold annually, that they should meet at least once a year at the seat of government for 2 sessions, one commencing the first Monday of February and the other the first Monday of August. There were some changes subsequent, but the last major, at least numerical change, was after the Civil War. The Judiciary Act of 1869 expanded the court to consist of a Chief Justice plus 8 Associate Justices. And this act also created separate judicial positions for the U.S. Circuit Courts, and provided that federal judges could retire and have a pension. Okay. Now, why did I spend so much time on that? Well, I'm going to do a section on religious and how the Supreme Court, how the judicial branch has treated religious liberty in the country. John Jay's most enduring achievement as Chief Justice of the court was the case of Chisholm versus Georgia in 1793. That the Constitution allows a citizen of a state to bring suit against another state, even if that state has not waived sovereign immunity. In response to the court's decision, the 11th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, giving states sovereign immunity from suits by citizens of other states and foreign nations. So that amendment was January 8th, 1798. But that happened later. Let's see. In 1790, on July 16th, the District of Columbia was established as the seat of the United States government. And on July 26th of the same year, so 10 days later, Congress passed Alexander Hamilton's Assumption Plan, making the federal government responsible for state debts to ensure that they would all be repaid. Note, this was the first bailout in American history, and frankly, a tactic for weaning states away from their desire for autonomy into accepting a stronger central government in exchange for the availability of more financial resources. For example, Virginia had withdrawn its opposition to Hamilton's assumption plan in return for having the nation's new capital located partially within its borders. In the following year, March 29, 1791, Washington and a French engineer-architect named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant examined the site of the district along the Potomac River. Washington was given the power by Congress to select the exact situation. Originally, it was 10 miles square. Now it's 68 miles within diamond-shaped boundaries, made up of land given by Virginia and Maryland. Okay. The United States was the first of the European colonies outside of Europe to successfully revolt and achieve its independence. The second was Haiti. Now, in terms of the process of European colonization, actually began in Europe. The Romans did it. The Roman Empire did it. They conquered other territories within Europe, made them colonies, then provinces. So, and that process continued. Stronger countries colonize, subjugate the weaker countries. As Thucydides wrote in Antiquity, let's see how you put it, the strong do as they will, the weak endure what they must. So Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, attempted 3 times to break away from the Holy Roman Empire and achieve its independence, and it was crushed each time. Switzerland was the first constituent member, essentially a colony of the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, to successfully revolt and achieve its independence. That was in 1499. But so the United States was actually the second, but it was the first outside of Europe to successfully revolt and achieve its independence. So then Haiti would either be the third if you count Switzerland, or the second if you just look outside of Europe. Okay, the Haitian Revolution, August 22nd, 1791 through January 1st, 1804. Whatever else you enumerate it, the Haitian Revolution is also the first successful slave revolt to create a new nation in history. And as I said, the second successful colonial revolt after the United States against a European mother country, in this case France. All right, on the 5th of December, 1492, Columbus landed on a Caribbean island which he named the Spanish island, Hispaniola. In a treaty signed in 1697, that's a Treaty of Ryswick, ending the War of the Grand Alliance, France received the western third of this island, which they named Saint Domingue. Beginning in 1713, a commercial migration of Frenchmen from Bordeaux relocated to Saint Domingue in order to exploit its potential for sugar production. This is sugar cane, not beet sugar. This is sugar cane, which means plantations, which means slaves. This sugar industry flourished until the French colony, that one French colony, was producing 40% of the world's sugar. 18th century sugar plantations in the Caribbean were essentially death camps because the 5-year mortality rate among slaves in the field was almost statistically absolute. They say you can never say 100% because there's always somebody who might live more than 5 years. But it was certainly, 99% fatal. Now that's of the field slaves. There were the house slaves, as they say. There were the domestic slaves, or those engaged in other fields that, of course, could live, a full, well, not full in the sense of, but I mean, they could live a complete lifespan, an adult lifespan. So that 5-year mortality rate is for those actually working in the fields. The intensity of the labor, coupled the heat, the climate, coupled with the astronomical profits to be made, convinced French rulers that the effort was justified. For this reason, France subsidized vast expeditions to capture whole groups of African slaves in Africa and to transport them across the ocean to these plantations. The result was that the population of Saint-Domingue consisted of 40,000 whites and 500,000 African slaves. Because of the high mortality rate among the workers required constant supplies of fresh slaves, the field slaves were, for the most part, young adult males who remembered life in Africa, had actually grown up there, and had learned how to hunt and fish. This set them apart from domestic slaves, born in slavery, who might be multi-generational descendants of domestic slaves, who worked in the mansions of the French owners, and therefore had never learned how to hunt or fish or survive in the wild on their own. So, for this particular group of field slaves, the thought of surviving in the mountains was not at all intimidating, and the alternative of working to death in the field drove many of them to escape. These escaped African slaves banded together in the mountains and were a constant source of anxiety to the French colonists. They survived partially through hunting and partially through raiding French commerce. The few French expeditions sent into the mountains to capture them disappeared, so they stopped doing that. The actual Haitian Revolution began on August 22, 1791, as what the French colonists initially believed was an isolated slave uprising. However, when the surviving plantation owners got together and laid out a map and figured out what happened when, in the close proximity of time, but the wide extent of the geographical action, it turned out that 2,000 whites were killed and 280 plantation mansions were burned to the ground. So it was clear that there was scale and coordination, indicating planning and strategy beyond an ordinary slave revolt. After Napoleon seized power in France, he didn't want to lose this colony because he needed the money. He had the fantasy that he was going to invade England, and that of course that never worked out. But he still at this point he still had that delusion that he was going to do that. So he needed money, and the sugar plantation was the colony of sugar plantations was a lucrative source of revenue. So he dispatched his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with an army of 30,000 French soldiers to recapture the island and reimpose slavery in 1801. This French army was completely wiped out in the mountains, and so the French eventually conceded defeat. The name of Saint-Domingue was changed to Haiti, which was a French form, a Gallicized form of the Taino Indian word for the island, Haiti, which means land of the mountains. And Haiti became an independent country. And it's been subject to torture, and invasion and occupation and sanctions and embargoes, and just an endless procession of torment ever since. But it did become its own country. On, uh, on November 7th, 1791, Bishop Carroll held the first Synod of Baltimore, attended by 22 priests of 5 nationalities. His new diocese covered 3 million square miles, which presented the problem of shortage of priests. For reasons already covered, Carroll was averse to sending candidates to Rome for priestly training. The recently erupted French Revolution and the following wars, all the coalition wars against Napoleon, which lasted for 26 years, between the French Revolution and the final fall of Napoleon. It's a generation. Europe was plunged into one war after another. So this meant it was not safe for him to send recruits to seminaries in Europe, or even his own alma mater in Belgium. So out of necessity, Carroll brought priestly formation into the new republic. The first seminary in North America was not in the United States, it was in Quebec. On April 1st, 1658, a member of the Society of the Foreign Missions, who's now beatified, Blessed Francois Laval, was ordained apostolic vicar of New France, what is now Canada. Part of his missionary strategy was to cultivate priestly vocations among the families of the French colonists by establishing a seminary where their sons could study for the priesthood locally without the long and dangerous voyage back to Europe. So on March 26, 1663, Laval founded the first seminary in North America, the Seminary of the Foreign Missions. It had, in Quebec, it had 8 French and 6 Huron students. It was affiliated with the Seminary of the Foreign Missions in Paris, from which institution Laval obtained the first faculty of his colonial seminary. The first martyrdom within the current borders of the state of Louisiana occurred in 1706, and it was inflicted on a graduate of Laval's seminary, a French-Canadian priest, Jean-François Buisson, along with 4 lay companions, were killed in the course of his attempt to establish a mission station among the Chitimacha tribe near present-day Donaldsonville, in the current diocese of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, I mentioned the Society of Saint-Sulpice. On May 21st, 1633, Jean-Jacques Ollier, O-L-I-E-R, was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Paris. Inspired by the Oratorian movement of St. Philip Neri, Ollier, along with 2 priests and 8 seminarians, opened such an oratory in a suburb of Paris. News of their success spread, leading to Ollier taking over a functioning church parish. Ollier and his oratorians accepted the parish of Saint-Sulpice, that's Sulpice, in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, Paris, in 1642. Ollier opened a seminary, as planned, on October 1st of that same year, initially in the rectory, then in a larger building in the parish. Within 2 years, the oratorio and the seminary had seminarians from 20 dioceses in France who lived in community with the priest while taking classes at the Sorbonne and assisting in parish work. The plenitude of labors involved in the Saint-Sulpice project, parish combination seminary combination oratory, prompted Ollier to establish the Society of the Priests of Saint-Sulpice on September 6, 1645, modeled on the oratory of St. Philip Neri, but with a distinct mission, the mission of seminary formation. The society would open the first seminary in the United States, which still exists, St. Mary's in Baltimore, in a manner that we'll get to in due course. But that only happened, as I alluded to earlier, but now we see it in another context, because of this. On July 14th, 1789, a mob stormed the Bastille in Paris, beginning the French Revolution. A brief chronology of its spiral down. On November 2nd, the French revolutionary government nationalized church property, quote, at the disposal of the nation. And that, by now you know, nationalize means steal. That is steal, church property. The following year, 1790, on February 13th, all religious orders were dissolved by act of the government. July 12th, 1790, the government promulgated the civil constitution of the clergy, which turned the remaining clergy into employees of the state. On November 27th of the same year, 1790, the National Assembly, meaning the revolutionary government, voted to require these clergy to sign an oath of loyalty to the civil constitution, above their loyalty to the Pope, in other words. On October 21st, 1793, all priests who refused to do this, and all persons who harbored such refusing priest, were sentenced to death. They were liable they could be killed on sight. Of the 47,000 priests in France, when the revolution began, 30,000 priests refused and went into exile, many to the United States. 2,000 of those priests were captured and murdered. The rest of the priests who did collaborate, well, the rest either just left the priesthood, just became laymen, and just didn't bother with any of it, or they collaborated. They stayed priests. They collaborated with the revolution. At the time the revolution began, there were 74 bishops in France. Only 4 of them collaborated. The rest were either captured and killed, or they went into exile. On the 10th of November, 1793, the government dispensed with all of that and officially de-Christianized the country. Celebrated with a festival of reason held in the former Cathedral of Paris, Notre Dame Cathedral. During the French Revolution, back in the United States, on December 15th, 1791, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. This is the first 10 amendments. Written in response to calls from several states for greater constitutional protection for individual liberties. James Madison was then a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He went through the Constitution, making changes where he thought most appropriate to accommodate these concerns. But several representatives, led by Roger Sherman, objected that Congress did not have the authority to change the wording of the Constitution itself. Therefore, Madison's changes were presented as a list of amendments that would follow Article 7 of the Constitution. So initially, they were talking about 17 amendments. Of those, the Senate approved 12. Those 12 were sent to the states for approval in August of 1789. Of those 12, 10 were ratified. Virginia's legislature became the last to ratify on December 15, 1791. For our purposes, for religious history, the First Amendment to the Constitution is the most significant, and it consists of one sentence, and is one of the most twisted sentences in American history. But there's a reason it was phrased this way. So the full text reads, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And that's it. One sentence. That's the First Amendment. But there's a great deal in that one amendment. So Congress, the legislature, now remember the background, that all these people, they remembered the Church of England was established, and they had to pay taxes to it, whether they agreed with it or not. So that's why it was phrased that Congress, which made the laws under the new Constitution, could make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then it goes on with the freedom of speech and press, and etc. So the reference to establishment of religion, carefully worded, and that's the key to understanding the mind of the framers of the document at the time this was written. It reflected more the resentment of the colonists, remembered resentment, that they had to pay taxes to support the Church of England, rather than a direct attack on the Catholic Church. Because at the time, the Catholic population was confined to only, were really one of the 13. I mean, they actually had a few in Pennsylvania also, but the majority of the Catholics in the United States were in Maryland, and even there were only 12% of the population of Maryland was Catholic, and that's the one that had the largest Catholic population. Okay, so this phrase, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. As we covered the Supreme Court, I mentioned how the creation of the Supreme Court and what the founders were thinking, with the Federalists, who designed this form of government, what they thought the court was going to be. And now we'll see how those two things come together. This constitutional prohibition from establishing religion or abridging the free exercise thereof with the judicial branch. And we can't go through every state, so we'll just look at a few Supreme Court cases. So the Supreme Court, or SCOTUS, as they call it, the Supreme Court of the United States, has ruled inconsistently on matters of religious freedom. Religious freedom was mentioned only once in the original text of the Constitution. That was Article 6. Quote, and this is just an excerpt, "The senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." So this prohibition, the no religious test clause, banned the conventional method of using the law to legitimize religious discrimination. As covered earlier in the course, in England, religious tests were used to establish the Church of England as an official national church. The Test Acts, in force from the 1660s until the 1820s, required all government officials to take an oath disclaiming or denying the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation and affirming the Church of England's teaching. These laws excluded Catholics, obviously, but also members of dissenting Protestant sects, because they had no problem denying transubstantiation, but they could not affirm all of the Church of England's teachings. Yet they still had to pay taxes to support the church, the established church. William Blackstone, who wrote the famous commentaries on the laws of England in the 18th century, he explained the value of such religious tests to protect the established church and the government, quote, against perils from nonconformists of all denominations, infidels, Turks, Jews, heretics, papists, and sectarians, end quote. During the period of debate over the new U.S. Constitution, religious qualifications for holding office did exist at the state level. Delaware's Constitution, for example, required government officials to profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost. North Carolina barred anyone who denied the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion. To bar them from serving in government. Unlike the rule in England, however, every state of the new United States did allow any Protestants of all variations to serve in government. Yet, like the Test Acts in England, the religious test in the states did exclude Catholics, Mormons, and non-Christians from holding office based on their faith. Supporters of religious tests such as these claimed that they did not violate freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, because holding public office was a privilege, not a right. Effectively, such tests allowed minority religions to practice their faith while reserving government power to Protestants. Conversely, supporters of the Constitution's prohibition of such tests regarded their method, meaning the prohibition of the test, as advancing religious freedom and protecting politically powerless faith groups against discrimination. And that is a view that prevailed, enshrined in Article 6 of the Constitution. But tension has remained throughout U.S. history, with the Supreme Court ruling all over the place in matters of belief versus non-belief, as well as matters balancing private religious freedom versus government coercive power. And in the question that we saw back in the colonial period is it the proper role of law to criminalize moral vices that are not a direct threat to others, based on the view that such individual moral vices do blight the community as a whole? Is that the proper role of government, to do that? Should moral vices also be crimes? In 1785, Virginia statesman and future president James Madison argued against state support of Christian religious instruction. He did not argue against Christian religious instruction. He argued against state support, meaning tax money used to support Christian religious instruction. As covered previously, the population of the 13 English colonies came from a multiplicity of religious backgrounds. There were Puritans predominating in New England, in the North, Anglicans predominated in the South, Quakers and Lutherans predominated in Pennsylvania, Catholics settled mostly in Maryland, but did not predominate at all, not at this period. Presbyterians were most numerous in the middle colonies, like the Carolinas. There were Jewish congregations in only five cities in the 13 colonies. So they were here, but certainly did not predominate anywhere. During colonial times, the Church of England was established by law in all of the southern colonies, while localized Puritan or Congregationalist establishments held sway in New England. In those colonies, clergy were appointed and disciplined by colonial authorities, and colonists were required to pay taxes and often required to attend church services. Dissenters were often punished for preaching without a license or refusing to pay taxes to a church they disagreed with. Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and much of New York did not have any established church, but the others did. After independence, there was widespread agreement that there should be no nationally established church because they couldn't agree. The Calvinists did not want to pay taxes to the Episcopal Church. The Episcopals didn't want to pay to support the Calvinist churches, etc. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, authored by James Madison, reflects that consensus. By 1833, all states had disestablished religion. Yet the Supreme Court has continued to hear cases regarding the Establishment Clause, and they're contested, sometimes leading to the 5-4 splits. And so that's why the First Amendment was phrased the way it was. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's more that second phrase. What does the free exercise of religion mean? Notice the complete absence of the often used phrase, wall of separation between church and state. This is another one. Like if I were teaching this to high school, this would be another case where I'd hold up a $10 bill and say, this goes to the first one of you who can find the wall of separation between church and state in the Constitution, and it's not there. That phrase originated outside of the constitutional context, but later individual justices used it and referred to it and brought it into Supreme Court rulings on constitutional issues, but the phrase itself is not in the Constitution. So the background originated 11 years later. On the 7th of October, 1801, the Reverends Nehemiah Dodge, Ephraim Robbins, and Stephen Nelson wrote to the new president, Thomas Jefferson, on behalf of the Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut, expressing these concerns. Quote, "Our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty, that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbors. But, sir, our constitution of government is not specific. Our ancient charter, together with the law made coincident therewith, were adopted on the basis of our government at the time of our revolution, and such had been our laws and usages, and such still are, that religion is considered as the first object of legislation, and therefore what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men. It is not to be wondered at, therefore, if those who seek after power and gain under the pretense of government and religion should reproach their fellow men, should reproach their order magistrate as an enemy of religion, law, and good order, because he will not, dare not, assume the prerogatives of Jehovah and make laws to govern the kingdom of Christ. Sir, we are sensible that the President of the United States is not the national legislator, and also sensible that the national government cannot destroy the laws of each state. But our hopes are strong that the sentiments of our beloved President, which have had such genial effect already, like the radiant beams of the sun, will shine and prevail through all these states and all the world, till hierarchy and tyranny be destroyed from the earth. President Jefferson replied in a letter dated January 1st, 1802, in part in this way, quote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. So this is it. This is the original context. That phrase, wall of separation, which does not appear in the Constitution, has become so famous that it has been applied by the Supreme Court. Now note, again, Jefferson, he had these, but he was also a pragmatist. 2 days after he sent that letter, 2 days, he sent it on January 1st. On January 3rd, he attended a church service conducted in the House of Representatives. Religious intolerance in the United States has proceeded as a routine feature of U.S. history, manifesting at times as overt violence against Catholics and against Mormons. In the early national period, for example, a Protestant mob in Charlestown, Massachusetts, on August 11th and 12th, 1834, culminated in an Ursuline convent being burned down. 13 were arrested, 12 were acquitted, 1 was convicted, but subsequently pardoned by the governor. 4 years later, Mormons, led by Joseph Smith, clashed with the Protestant majority in Missouri in 1838. The governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, ordered that all Mormons be exterminated or expelled from the state. At Haun's Mill, Missouri, state militia members, massacred 17 Mormons on October 30th, 1838. And those are just a couple of examples. 30 years later, after the Civil War, and we'll discuss the Civil War separately, but just taking this unit just on a brief, superficial review of the Supreme Court's dealing with rights of religion. After the Civil War, there were 3 constitutional amendments were passed with the Civil War in mind and the ending of slavery in mind. One of which was the 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868. It applied federal constitutional protections of the 5th Amendment to states, among other things. Section 1, quote, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." A decade later, the Supreme Court decided that religion is not permitted to interfere with government, but government is free to interfere with religion. The origin of the case can be traced 6 years before the amendment. On the 8th of July, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act. Now, this is Morrill, Morrill. It's named for a person. What was his name? Justin Smith Morrill. He was Vermont, representative for Vermont. The Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act obviously outlawed bigamy in federal territories, and specifically Utah, and limited church ownership of property in U.S. territories to $50,000. Now, this obviously and intentionally was directed at the Mormons. So, the second president of the Church of Latter-day Saints, as the Mormons called, the second president was Brigham Young. He asked his secretary, George Reynolds, if he, Reynolds, would be willing to serve as a test case to challenge this the act, believing it was unconstitutional, that it violated the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Liberty, depriving of liberty, and due process of law, lack of equal protection, And Reynolds agreed. So he was arrested. He was indicted for bigamy by a grand jury on June 23rd, 1874. He was found guilty on December 9th for marrying Amelia Jane Schofield while still married to Mary Ann Tuddingham. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment at hard labor and a fine of $500. And that's 1875, $500. It was appealed, of course, but they lost on appeal. On June 13th, 1876, the Utah Supreme Court upheld the conviction. So the LDS, the Latter-day Saints, appealed to the Supreme Court, leading to the Reynolds v. United States case. Arguments were heard on November 14th, 1878. On January 6th, 1879, SCOTUS issued its unanimous decision against Reynolds. Reynolds' attorneys had argued that his conviction for bigamy should be overturned because it was his religious duty as a Mormon to marry multiple times, the practice of which, they further argued, was protected by the First Amendment as a fundamental duty of his religion. The First Amendment said Congress shall make no law abridging the free exercise of religion. And on January 6, 1879, SCOTUS rejected this reasoning, essentially concluding that the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act did not violate the Constitution, even though it would seem by definition that it did, because Congress did make that law, and it did abridge the free exercise of that particular aspect of the Mormon religion. Reynolds, I doubt they thought it would get this bad, even if they lost. But he had to serve. He served his full sentence, 2 years. He was released in 1881. He returned to his position in the LDS Church, remained there until his death from meningitis in 1909 at the age of 67. So in the ruling, the court decided that the law prohibiting bigamy did not meet the standard of protected free exercise of religion. Therefore, it upheld the criminalization of polygamy on the reasoning that polygamy was, quote, now this is from the decision, quote, odious among the northern and western nations of Europe, and, until the establishment of the Mormon Church, almost exclusively a feature of the life of Asiatic and African people. As such, polygamy fetters the people in stationary despotism. Further, the court then asserted a slippery slope argument that if this were allowed, like if they had overturned the, or say if they would allow polygamy, that if polygamy were allowed, based on free exercise argument, that someone might eventually argue that human sacrifice was a necessary part of their religion. And, quote, to permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and, in effect, to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. So, it amounted to the court ruled that the First Amendment forbade Congress from legislating against opinion, but allowed it to interfere with practice. So, government can interfere with religion, but religion cannot interfere with government. George Cannon, who was a representative of the Utah Territory, and he was Mormon, he wrote in response to this decision, quote, our crime has been, we married women instead of seducing them. We reared children instead of destroying them. We desired to exclude from the land prostitution, bastardy, and infanticide. If George Reynolds is to be punished, let the world know the facts. Let it be published to the four corners of the earth that in this land of liberty, the most blessed and glorious upon which the sun shines, the law is swiftly invoked to punish religion, but justice goes limping and blindfolded in pursuit of crime. And after that, the LDS in the United States just, by policy, then prohibited polygamy. Fast forwarding to the 20th century. Now, in 1922, in the state of Oregon, the Oregon school system took part in a decision to Americanize their schools. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and the Scottish Rite Masons organized a system requiring all children between the ages of 8 and 16 to attend public schools. To enforce this law, parents or guardians who did not send their children to the public schools were subject to a $100 fine and to 30 days in jail. The statute was soon challenged by the School Sisters of the Holy Name and, obviously an order of Catholic nuns, as well as Hill Military Academy, which is not Catholic. I mean, it was non-denominational. I mean, it was not officially affiliated, but it was majority Protestant. So this was a case that it united Catholics and Protestants. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court ruled that Oregon could not constitutionally compel all students to attend public schools. And this was decided by a unanimous vote on June 1st, 1925. The Associate Justice James Clark McReynolds wrote the majority opinion, stating that children were not the mere creatures of the state, and that by its very nature, the traditional American understanding of the term liberty prevented the state from forcing students to accept instruction only from public schools. He stated that this responsibility belonged to the child's parents or guardians, and that the ability to make such a choice was a liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. So this decision has to be understood in the context to appreciate why it differed from previous decisions. Those previous decisions which did support the right of government to interfere with belief and practice. The Oregon school law did not only apply to Catholics and Mormons. It would have the effect of closing Protestant schools, as well as non-religious schools. Therefore, this was not a change of principle that government can interfere with religion. Rather, it was a federal limitation on state overreach against both private secular and religious education. Now, this next case did not directly go to the Supreme Court, but it did spawn an issue which ultimately did. And this is the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes. The Scopes monkey trial is probably better known as, in 1925. This was the prosecution of a science teacher, John Scopes, for teaching evolution in Dayton, Tennessee public school, which a recent bill had made illegal. So, a state representative in Tennessee, John W. Butler, he was a farmer, and he was head of the World Christian Fundamentalists Association, lobbied the state legislature to pass anti-evolution laws after hearing that public school teachers were mocking the Bible, using Darwinian, the evolution, to mock the Bible. He succeeded when the Butler Act was passed in Tennessee on March 25, 1925. In response, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, financed the test case in which John Scopes, a Tennessee high school science teacher, agreed to be tried for violating the act. On May 5, 1925, he was charged with teaching evolution from a chapter in George William Hunter's textbook titled Civic Biology. Three-time presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan, B-R-Y-A-N, volunteered to present for the prosecution. He was a politician already well known as an anti-evolution activist, almost single-handedly creating the national controversy over the teaching of evolution and making his name inseparable from the issue. Clarence Darrow, a famous criminal defense attorney, who had recently acted for the defense for Leopold and Loeb in their kidnapping murder trial, found out about the Scopes trial through the journalist H.L. Mencken, who suggested that Darrow should defend Scopes. Bryan and Darrow set the tone by immediately attacking each other in the press, turning it into a media circus. The ACLU attempted to remove Darrow from the case, fearing that they would lose control, but none of the efforts worked. The case was pushed forward and a trial set for July 10th. The jury took 9 minutes to pronounce Scopes guilty. He was fined $100. Scopes was offered a new teaching contract elsewhere, but chose to leave Dayton and study geology at the University of Chicago Graduate School. He eventually became a petroleum engineer. The controversy over the teaching of science and evolution continued into the 21st century. In 2005, the case of Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District fought over the constitutionality of teaching intelligent design in Pennsylvania schools alongside evolution. This was a Supreme Court case, and it ruled against intelligent design as a legitimate topic suitable for education, once again supporting belief over non-belief and supporting the government's right to interfere in religion, but not religion's right to oppose the interference of government. In 1939, 14 years after the Scopes trial, Newton Cantwell and his sons, who were Jehovah's Witnesses, were proselytizing in a neighborhood in Connecticut. They were traveling door to door and approaching people on the street. 2 pedestrians reacted violently. Cantwell and his sons were arrested and charged with violation of a Connecticut statute requiring solicitors to obtain a permit before soliciting funds from the public, and they were accused of inciting a common law breach of the peace. In a unanimous decision, the state court, Supreme, they lost in the state courts, so they went to the Supreme Court. The SCOTUS held the Cantwell's actions were protected by the First and 14th Amendments. While writing for the court, Justice Owen Roberts reasoned that while general regulations on solicitation were legitimate, Restrictions based on religious grounds were not. Because the statute allowed local officials to determine which causes were religious and which ones were not, it violated the First and 14th Amendments. The court also held that while the maintenance of public order was a valid state interest, it could not be used to justify the suppression of free communication of views. The Cantwell's message, while offensive to many, did not threaten bodily harm and was protected religious speech. So this Cantwell versus Connecticut case, 1940, was the first time the court applied the Free Exercise Clause to the states, supporting belief over non-belief. 6 years later, a New Jersey law authorized reimbursement by local school boards of the cost of transportation to and from schools, including private schools. 96% of the private schools that benefited from this law were parochial Catholic schools. A person named Arch Everson, who was a citizen, a taxpayer in Ewing Township, New Jersey, filed a lawsuit alleging that this indirect aid to religion violated both the New Jersey state constitution and the First Amendment. After losing in state courts, Everson appealed to the Supreme Court on purely federal constitutional grounds. Did the New Jersey statute violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? So this is the Everson versus the Board of Education of the Township of Ewing, New Jersey. Argument, it was argued on November 20th, 1946, decided on February 10th, 1947. Split decision, 5-4. For the Board of Education. The majority opinion was written by Hugo Black. The New Jersey law reimbursing parents for transportation costs to parochial schools did not violate the Establishment Clause, as it did not pay money directly to parochial schools. It went to the parents. Nor did it support them directly in any way. It was rather enacted to assist parents of all religions, or no religion, with getting their children to school. So that's how it got passed. It was not only aid, in other words, to religious families. Let's see, 13 years later. Yeah. In 1960, the governor of Maryland appointed Roy Torcaso, Torcaso, as a notary public. At the time, the Constitution of Maryland required a declaration of belief in the existence of God in order for a person to hold any office of profit or trust in the state. Torcaso refused to make such a statement because he was a declarative atheist, so his appointment was revoked. Torcaso filed suit and lost, with the Maryland Court of Appeals declaring, quote, "The petitioner is not compelled to believe or disbelieve under threat of punishment or other compulsion. True, unless he makes the declaration of belief, he cannot hold public office in Maryland, but he is not compelled to hold public office." Torcaso took the matter to the Supreme Court, where it was heard on April 24th, 1961. This is the Torcaso versus Watkins case, in which the Supreme Court unanimously held that religious test for state office holding violated the religion clause of the First Amendment, stating, quote, "Neither a state nor the federal government can constitutionally force a person to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. Neither can constitutionally pass laws or impose requirements which aid all religions as against non-believers, and neither can aid those religions based on a belief in the existence of God, as against those religions founded on different beliefs. So Judge Hugo Black delivered the unanimous opinion that such a requirement places the state of Maryland on the side of those who believe in God and willing to state that belief. With this requirement, Maryland, the court judged, Maryland effectively aided religions that profess belief in God at the expense of any other form of belief or disbelief. And further, that the First Amendment expressly prohibits a state from taking this position. Although the person does have the option of not pursuing public office rather than declaring a belief, the test is an unconstitutional encroachment on the freedom of religion. So in this case, SCOTUS applied the religious freedom ideal of the Constitution to protect non-belief over belief. This is consistent with one continuity in U.S. history we traced as originating in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, that a religious view of the world was unsafe, so that reason and government power based on reason must serve as a protection from religion. The case was heard the next year, this 1962. Engel, E-N-G-E-L, v. Vitale, V-I-T-A-L-E, 1962. The New York State Board of Regents authorized a short, voluntary prayer for recitation at the start of each school day. The full text of the prayer was, quote, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence on Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen." End quote. Question: does the reading of a non-denominational prayer at the start of the school day violate the Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment? The Supreme Court ruled 6-1 in favor of Stephen Engel, who protested. Once again, the majority opinion delivered by Hugo Black, that the state cannot hold prayers in public schools, even if participation is voluntary, and even if the prayer is not tied to a particular church or religion. The court further held that the respondent's decision, meaning the New York's decision, to use its school system to facilitate recitation of a prayer violated the Establishment Clause. Specifically, the policy breached the constitutional wall of separation. So they referred to that, which of course is not in the Constitution, but they called it the constitutional wall of separation based on that Jefferson letter we read earlier. The court ruled that the constitutional prohibition of laws establishing religion meant that government had no business drafting formal prayers for any segment of its population to repeat in a government-sponsored religious program. The court held that New York's provision of the contested daily prayer was inconsistent with the Establishment Clause. Connected was the case of the School District of Abington Township, Pennsylvania, v. Edward Lewis Schempp, S-C-H-E-M-P-P. The Abington case began when Edward Schempp, a Unitarian and a resident of Abington Township, Pennsylvania, filed suit against the school district in the U.S. District Court, the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, to prohibit the enforcement of a Pennsylvania state law that required his children, specifically Ellery Schempp, therefore that's how he had standing, to hear and sometimes read portions of the Bible as part of their public school education. So that law, and Pennsylvania law, required at least 10 verses from the Bible be read without comment at the opening of each public school on each school day. Schempp specifically contended that the statute violated his and his family's rights under the First and 14th Amendments. Pennsylvania law, like that of 4 other states at the time, included a statute compelling school districts to perform Bible readings in the mornings before classes. 25 states had laws allowing optional Bible reading, with the remainder of the states having no laws supporting or rejecting Bible reading. In 11 of those states with laws supportive of Bible reading, the state courts had declared the laws to be unconstitutional. A related case was that brought by Madeline Murray O'Hare, mother of the plaintiff. Again, that's how she had standing. She says it violated her son's rights. William J. Murray III. On his behalf, she filed suit against the local school system in Baltimore. This is the Murray v. Carrollton case to prohibit compulsory prayer and Bible reading in public schools. She's also, in the same year, 1963, founded the American Atheist Society. Her case, the Supreme Court took her case, the Murray case, and the Schempp case, and consolidated it. The district court had ruled that the statute, the Bible reading statute, did violate the First Amendment. Even after the statute had been amended to permit any student to excuse himself or herself. The court so they consolidated with the Maryland case. The conclusion, in an 8-1 decision, with a majority opinion written by Justice Tom C. Clark, was that public schools cannot sponsor Bible reading or recitation of the Lord's Prayer under the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Concluding that, in both cases, Pennsylvania and Maryland, the laws required religious exercises and that such exercises directly violated the First Amendment. Justice Stewart was the only one who dissented. He expressed the view that it was not establishing a church or establishing a particular religion. Just to read the Bible, read from the Bible. Especially since a child could opt out. So the logic was that if it really was an established church, then there would not be the right to opt out. About a decade later, 9 years later, the Lemon v. Kurtzman case. Rhode Island's Salary Supplement Act provided for a 15% salary supplement to be paid to teachers in non-public schools at which the average per-pupil expenditure on secular education was below the average spent in public schools. The act went into effect on July 1st, 1968, and the first reimbursement payments to schools were made on September 2nd, 1969, which triggered the challenge. Eligible teachers could teach only courses offered in the public schools, using only materials used in the public schools, meaning, teaching math using the same math book, English using the same English book. Further, they had to agree not to teach courses in religion. A 3-judge court found that about 25% of the state's elementary students attended non-public schools. About 95% of those attended Roman Catholic schools, and that up to that point of the challenge, 250 teachers at Catholic schools were the sole beneficiaries of this act. So they got the 15% supplement. So the court found that the parochial school system was an integral part of the religious mission of the Catholic Church, and held that the act, the Rhode Island Salary Supplement Act, fostered excessive entanglement between government and religion, thus violating the Establishment Clause. All right, I'll skip all that. Well, what's the most significant thing about this? In an 8-0 decision, the court set out, created the Lemon test, Lemon. It's named for the person. I thought I had the person's full name. The Lemon test. So this Lemon test is 3 parts to determine the constitutionality of a statute with relation to religion, state and religion. So a statute is constitutional if, first, it has a primarily secular purpose. Second, its principal effect neither aids nor inhibits religion. Third, that government and religion are not excessively entangled. On that basis, the court struck down the law as violating the Establishment Clause, finding that the statute constituted an excessive government entanglement with religion. Even though the teachers were not teaching religion, and they specifically had to promise not to teach religion, they were teaching only secular subjects using the same books in public schools, yet the court decided that it was excessive government entanglement with religion. So that was Lemon versus Kurtzman, 1971. 7 years later, McDaniel versus Patty, P-A-T-Y, 1978. Regarding religious ministers holding public office. Since its first state constitution in 1796, Tennessee had a statute that prohibited ministers from serving as legislators. In 1977, Reverend Paul McDaniel, a Baptist minister from Chattanooga, Tennessee, filed as a candidate for the state constitutional convention. Another candidate, Selma Cash Patty, sued for a declaratory judgment that McDaniel was disqualified by the state constitution owing to his status as a minister. The lower court held that the statute was unconstitutional, that the statute prohibiting the ministers from running was unconstitutional because it violated the First and 14th Amendments. McDaniel's name remained on the ballot and he was elected. After the election, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the judgment of the lower court and held that the statute did not restrict any expression of religious belief. The court held that the state interest in maintaining the separation of church and state was sufficient to justify the restrictions of the statute. Case went to the Supreme Court, posing the question, does the Tennessee statute barring ministers of the gospel or priests of any denomination whatever from serving as legislators violate the free exercise of religion? The ruling, yes. Chief Justice Warren Burger delivered the unanimous opinion of the court that the statute made the ability to exercise civil rights conditional on the surrender of religious rights, and therefore violated the First Amendment protection of free exercise of religion as applied to the states by the 14th Amendment. Justice Brennan concurred with the judgment, argued that the Tennessee statute essentially established a test of religious conviction in order to be eligible for office that disqualified anyone with a strong enough belief to join the clergy. Government imposition of the burden to choose between one's religious beliefs and the government's imposition of the burden and the desire to seek office is an unconstitutional restriction on the free exercise. He argued that the Establishment Clause does not give the government the power to discriminate against religious persons seeking or holding office. Yeah, those they just kind of kept repeating. Now, you may be wondering, with regard to Catholic priest, Father Gabriel Richard, who was a Sulpician, French Catholic priest, founder of the University of Michigan, was elected as a delegate from the Michigan Territory to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was the first Catholic priest to hold federal elected office. Now, he was French, so Father Gabriel Richard, but it's spelled Richard, R-I-C-H-A-R-D. He served in the House from 1823 to 1825. Father Robert Frederick Drinan, D-R-I-N-A-N, was a Jesuit priest, a lawyer, human rights advocate, and a Democrat. He was elected from the state of Massachusetts to the U.S. House of Representatives, serving from 1971 to 81. He was also a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center for the last 26 years of his life. Third, Father Robert John Cornell was a Norbertine priest and American politician, was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Wisconsin from 1975 to 1979. Both Father Drinan and Father Cornell abided by Pope John Paul II's prohibition on priests serving in political office. That decision was rendered in 1980, and so neither one ran for re-election. 1982. Mueller v. Allen, A-L-L-E-N. The Supreme Court examined whether a Minnesota state law allowing taxpayers to deduct from their state income tax expenses incurred in providing tuition, textbooks, and transportation for their children's elementary or secondary education, including private, secular, or parochial schools, violated the Establishment Clause. Another 5-4 split. The court upheld Minnesota's tax credit law as constitutional, applying the Lemon Test. Because the tax credits did not have the effect of advancing religion, they were available to all parents, religious or non-religious, and the principal effect neither aided nor inhibited religion and therefore did not excessively entangle government and religion. The following year, Marsh v. Chambers, 1983. The Supreme Court considered whether the Nebraska legislature violated the Establishment Clause in its practice of opening each session with a prayer offered by a chaplain paid from public funds. In a 6-3 decision, the court held that the Nebraska legislature's chaplaincy practice did not violate the Establishment Clause. However, in that decision, it looked past the Lemon Test, which the practice did not pass, to the long historical custom of the practice, dating back to the Continental Congress and the very first Congress that framed the Bill of Rights. The next year, 1984, Lynch v. Donnelly. The Supreme Court considered if the city of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, violated the Establishment Clause by including a nativity scene in the Christmas display in a public park, among other figures and decorations traditionally associated with Christmas. SCOTUS applied the Lemon test, and in another 5-4 decision, held that, quote, notwithstanding the religious significance of the creche, the city of Pawtucket has not violated the Establishment Clause. The principal purpose of the nativity scene was to celebrate and depict the origins of a national holiday, and in that it passed the Lemon test. Plus, it was not the only image that was displayed. You know, they had snowmen, reindeers, elves. So it was not just the nativity scene. Although, let's see, why does Christmas exist? Because of the nativity. So, oh well, go figure. Let's see. I'll skip that one. Um, 1992, Lee versus Wiseman. The Supreme Court examined whether officially approved clergy-led prayer at public school graduations in Providence, Rhode Island, violated the Establishment Clause. Applying the Lemon test, another 5-4 decision, held the practice to be a violation of the Establishment Clause. The opinion was written by Justice Anthony Kennedy. He wrote that the state government's involvement in the practice of clergy-led graduation prayer was pervasive to the point of creating a state-sponsored and state-directed religious exercise in a public school. That was 1992. The very next year, 1993, the Church of Lukumi Babalu v. City of Hialeah. The court considered whether ordinances passed by the city of Hialeah, Florida, banning animal sacrifice, violated the Free Exercise Clause. The text of those laws and the way they operated showed that they were not neutral, but instead targeted the Santeria religion, in which animal sacrifice is an important part. In a unanimous decision, SCOTUS held that because the ordinances were designed to persecute or oppress a specific religion and its practices, they did violate the free exercise. Let's see, then they go on about prayers at football games, but that's all just relitigating the same. Okay, this is more recent. This is about school vouchers. 2002, Zellman v. Simmons Harris. SCOTUS examined whether the state of Ohio's pilot project scholarship program violated the Establishment Clause in providing tuition vouchers for certain students in the Cleveland City School District, vouchers that could be used to attend participating public or private schools, including religious or non-religious schools, of their parents' choosing. Another 5-4 decision. SCOTUS held that the program aid was neutral in all respects toward religion, and therefore the program did not violate the Establishment Clause. Then there's the Ten Commandments decisions. All right. In 2007, Hein, H-E-I-N, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. That's actually the name, Freedom from Religion Foundation. The court considered whether taxpayers have standing to bring an Establishment Clause challenge against executive branch actions funded by general appropriations. This was from the George W. Bush administration, his Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, for the purpose of allowing religious charities to gain federal funding. The Freedom from Religion Foundation sued, asserting this to be a violation of the Establishment Clause. SCOTUS, another 5-4 decision, upheld the lower court's ruling that taxpayers do not have standing to bring Establishment Clause challenges against programs funded by the executive branch of government, because Establishment Clause challenges apply to congressional power under the Taxing and Spending Clause. And there are others, but anyway, you get the message. So the court has been kind of all over the place. Typically, statistically, it more often favors non-belief over belief, but there have been some exceptions. And with the Lemon Test, at least, so the Constitution does not define religion. It says that the Congress cannot pass a law, prohibiting interfering with the free exercise of religion, but it doesn't define what religion is. So the Lemon Test at least does provide a clear 3-part criteria, even though even subsequent to that, they haven't applied it uniformly, and we have a number of these 5-4 decisions. There were even a few more that I skipped over. Okay, so that's just a brief review of how SCOTUS has interpreted religious freedom and actually applying it to religious freedom or not. Okay, back to Carroll and the seminary, the first seminary in the United States. 4 French Sulpicians, priest, and 5 seminarians fleeing the French Revolution sailed from France on April 8, 1791. They arrived in Baltimore on July 10, 1791. Father Francois Charles Nagot, Nagot, was the first Sulpician superior in the United States. He had been vice superior of the seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris at the time of the French Revolution. They purchased the 1 Mile Tavern on the edge of the city of Baltimore, and they rededicated it. They dedicated the building to the Blessed Mother, and in October of 1791, opened classes with 5 students whom they brought from France. This was the beginning of St. Mary's, the first American, or the first Catholic seminary in the United States. They also engaged in missionary work as far away as Michigan and Illinois. Several became bishops, several Sulpicians, and we'll meet a few of them along the way. By the time of Bishop Carroll's death in 1815, 30 priests had been ordained after training at this proto-seminary, St. Mary's in Baltimore, which is still there. Bishop Carroll wrote about this to Cardinal Antonelli, prefect of the Propagation of the Faith, on April 23, 1792, in the following words, quote, "It is already known to the Sacred Congregation how singular a blessing has come to us from the disorders that threaten religion in France, since on account of the same has arisen the opportunity of sending thither some priest from the seminary of Saint-Sulpice at Paris. The establishment of a seminary is certainly a new and extraordinary spectacle for the people of this country. All our hopes are founded on the seminary of Baltimore." With the help of Bishop Carroll, the Sulpicians purchased additional property adjoining the 1 Mile Tavern and built St. Mary's College and Seminary on North Paca Street. St. Mary's was chartered as a college by the state of Maryland in 1805. St. Mary's was established as a theological seminary in 1822 by Pope Pius VII, when it was authorized as the first ecclesiastical faculty in the United States, with the right to grant degrees in the name of the Holy See. The undergraduate secular St. Mary's College closed in 1852. In 1929, St. Mary's Seminary, and then university, moved to a 40-acre campus at the southwest intersection of Roland and Belvedere Avenues in the Roland Park section of northern Baltimore City. The lawn of that new site was used as a helicopter pad for leaving to the local airport following the several days visit in 1995 of Pope, now St. John Paul II, to the city of Baltimore. And St. Mary's continues to exist. And those of you who are local, Bishop Shelton Favre is the Bishop of Houma-Thibodaux in southern Louisiana, is a graduate of St. Mary's in Baltimore. On the 25th of April, 1793, the Pope, Pope Pius VI, created the Diocese of Louisiana and the two Floridas, which includes New Orleans. So we will stop stop here, and we will pick up with that story next time. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.